So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay. This is the first replay that I've been doing ever since I got back from my most recent 3-week trip away for work, and it's going to be a free-for-all on a map that we have seen before, though not for quite some time. It is going to be CIRITH UNGOL, which does actually kind of suit a free-for-all, perhaps in the sense that it is rather a king of the hill kind of situation, in the sense that there is this fortress that one team can occupy. It's kind of lopsided, so it's not a perfectly balanced affair, but to give them their credit, the team that is over here actually isn't occupying that fortress at all, so that's going to be quite interesting to see if the fortress plays a big part in this battle or not, or whether it's just going to be within the labyrinthine canyons here. It's going to be 3 teams of 2, and that will mean that there's going to be a little bit of interchange as well between the various sides involved in this conflict today. I think that it's better in this regard when it is going to be teams rather than individual players, because otherwise they can be a little bit compartmentalised as a battle, but that isn't going to be the case this time, I think, mainly because the roads are such that it's going to funnel people into one another, and there is going to be a fair few rumbles, I think, and it's going to be painfully apparent really when people end up hiding in the corner, so we'll have to wait and see how this develops. It's quite long for a battle as well, and again, as typically, I've been away for 3 weeks, and they choose this exact moment to start sounding off in Discord. You love to see it. Anyway, doesn't really matter too much. We will be moving on to the army compositions right now. As I've already mentioned, the map is rather labyrinthine, and it is the centrepiece is the fortress, but it remains to be seen how big of a part that's going to play. And it's going to be 3 different kingdoms of men, albeit we can see some goblins in frame here as well. Starting off with the men of Rhudaur, it's going to be representing the north today. Starting off with a ballista, which on a map like this, if you know you're going to be playing on a map like CIRITH UNGOL with long sight lines that are rather linear, this kind of artillery piece can be very, very useful. And as we move into the runic army, we've already seen in the distance, their artillery also going to be doing very much the same sort of thing. So there could be a bit of an artillery duel going on here, but if not, it's also going to be very deadly against the infantry that's going to be clogging up the attacking lanes. Dunman Spearmen going to struggle in terms of quality here, but having said that, it's going to be a battle that's going to be more defined, I think, by damage dealing units more so than more solid defensive ones, which may suit Rhudaur a little bit more, given the fact that certainly Rohan, but even Rhun, are not really focused around their defensive values in the same way that many of the more established western kingdoms of men are, like Gondor. So it is going to come down to a little bit more damage. The Dunman Spearmen, though, not particularly damaging as a militia spear unit, as you would imagine. Granadine Rangers. This version of the game, of course, the Rangers are still the destroyers of worlds that they always were. And again, on a map like this, with long linear sight lines, if you can get into the right position with Rangers, they can be match winners for you. There is going to be more difficulty in this kind of battle, however, using them than there would be in a siege, for example, where you're on the defence. So there is going to be a little bit of finesse needed by the Womb Raider. It's worth stating as well that another one of the players on the field today did also send me this battle replay as well, but the Womb Raider got in there first, so we're going to be seeing it from his perspective. Rhudaur clansmen with the armour upgrade, certainly beefier than the militia tier spears in front of them. They've got a bigger shield value, they've got better armour, better all round, and it's exactly the kind of unit which can be very useful for simply holding a line, and Rhudaur's slightly stronger attacking stats also help mitigate a little bit of that spear malice that they suffer from against other infantry units. Reforged javelins, very good multi-purpose unit this, although the main purpose is going to be those javelins that they wield, but they do double as pretty nasty shock troops as well, with multiple HP and armour piercing with those spiked war maces. Trollshall axe throwers, of course, throwing projectiles are going to be the bread and butter of Rhudaur here. And if the battle does get bogged down in some of these pathways that lead through the mountains, then throwing projectiles are one of the best ways that you can break that stalemate, and few factions can match Rhudaur in that regard, and the Trollshall axe throwers will be very good at dealing with factions which focus a little bit less on armour, perhaps, like Rohan and Rhun, although they do have the armour-piercing option as well in the Atomor's Troll Hunters, which perhaps can be better deployed against some of the higher-end units that they're inevitably going to be facing off against. Some more standard archers as well in the Rhudaur marksmen, which can continue firing against the enemy for long periods of time, although even though they're not facing off against factions with plenty of heavy archers, Rhudaur is still probably the least archer-focused faction of those that are on display today. We also have some Granadine Berserkers back here, more throwing projectiles with the armour piercing. The cavalry component is quite interesting. We've already seen Rohan having some cavalry with them as well. We'll see if Rhun also. Rhudaur nobles are lance knights, which of course have that armor-piercing attack in melee, which makes them just a little bit more savage when it comes to dealing with other high-end cavalry units. And as far as single HP cavalry goes, javelin cavalry is still quite useful in this version of the game, because if all else fails, you can still use them like regular javelins against infantry, but they also make pretty good cavalry killers, which, considering Rohan are on the field, it makes the Coldfell Maidens a natural choice. The Wound Raiders' ally is going to be Medexa, who has also brought some Rhudaur Berserkers. I'd be very surprised not to see them, given the throwing projectile component that they possess. I am a little bit surprised, perhaps, that we didn't see much in the way of pikes from the Wound Raider. Even these basic Dunman pikemen could be very useful as the battle wears on, and if it comes down to a battle of attrition at the end, then having access to these pikes, which of course Rohan and Rhun don't have pikemen at all, could be the thing which makes the difference between victory and defeat here for Rhudaur. Rhudaur clansmen as well, albeit without the armour upgrade. Moving over here closer to the Rohirrim front line, we have some more troll short axe throwers and Dunman spearmen. These spears may be useful as sort of sacrificial ablative armour against any cavalry charges that come forth very quickly. More Dunman spearmen and more troll shores, more Etenmall's troll hunters, as well as more Dunman pikemen, something else for Rohan to be wary of. Plenty of spears and plenty of anti-cavalry. The Reforged javelins as well, having that armour-piercing edge both at range and in melee. More Etenmall's troll hunters, which of course spears in melee, which, considering the cavalry component that does seem to be at play here in this battle, may end up being very important. It's a very anti-cavalry focused army, this from Medexa, so he clearly expected Rohan to be his primary quarry. And then 2 Coldfell Maidens and the Rhudaur nobles once again, so the same cavalry setup, which is not too surprising. The only other cavalry Rhudaur have is the very low-tier Dunman outrunners, which are not going to be able to hold a candle to much of what the Rohirrim have to offer, speaking of which we have DF John, who has decided to bring some single HP cavalry, which in all fairness, somewhat recently we have seen be fairly effective. The Aerid of Aldberg are one such example that may prove to be effective, but they need to be very careful considering the javelin cavalry, the spears. They may be better off being saved until later on, honestly, given the makeup of the army which is directly across from them. Not a huge amount of archers in Medexa's army, however, so even these very basic Riddermark archers may be able to lay down a bit of a marker against their foes. There are some Eastmark spearmen in here, which are very cheap javelin/spearmen, but they're not really going to be as good as the equivalent Rhudaur units, but it does still make them, as militia spears, maybe capable of dishing out a little bit more punishment than the equivalent Dunman spearmen. We do have the Sons of Eorl, which are the lance knights which Rohan have to offer. They are not as expensive, I believe, as the Rhudaur nobles, but they don't have the armour piercing in melee either, so it's one of those interesting trade-offs perhaps, but I don't know. I mean, lance knights, we all know what to expect from them. The differences between them, ultimately in a real battle situation, are pretty limited at the end of the day. We have some Westmark infantry. This is the kind of unit which could be very, very handy against, especially Rhudaur, I would suggest, given that they are the least defence-focused faction on the field today. And the Westmark infantry will be able to carve through them, given their lack of armour when it comes to a straight-up fight. We have some Shield Maidens of Rohan, so this is one area in which Rohan can certainly rival Rhudaur. Rhudaur maybe have a few more throwing projectiles at their disposal, but Rohan can definitely at least contest that with them, and the Shield Maidens we've seen be very, very effective in the past, perhaps the most effective in this current version of the game, given the way that the meta is. It doesn't really suit Rohan, but that may change in the upcoming patch. Riddermark Spearmen and Westmark Spearmen represent a pretty solid front line, and as much as Rohan don't like facing off against armies chock full of spearmen, considering the cavalry-focused nature of some of the units they're facing off against today, it's a good thing they decided to bring these spears. Eastmark Axemen are a lower-end unit of infantry, but numbers are going to be important, especially given the free-for-all nature of this fight. You need to have deep reserves if you are to hang around until the late game. Medicel Guard, another unit of very high-end javelins, of course, albeit they're a little bit more defence-focused than the Reforged javelins we've already seen, which I do think makes them a little bit more useful in the long run. We do see the Reforged melt away pretty quickly in most battles, after all, when they have to get involved in melee, whereas the Medicels, we don't see Rohan all that often, but when we do, they often perform very well. The armour piercing of the Helm's Hammers may find themselves more useful against Rhun. Shield Maidens of Rohan. Helmingas are back here. This is going to be a pretty good unit of archers for skirmishing, especially against the less prepared force of Rhudaur. Ingomar is the other Rohirrim army, plenty of Westmarks here, Westmark spearmen, and infantry making up the backbone of the Rohirrim infantry force, which is going to be useful here. They may not have the same level of versatility in melee that the other cavalry-focused faction in Khand have, but in this kind of situation they should still suffice. Shield Maidens, we have plenty of cavalry over here as well. We've already talked about Javelin Cavalry, and the Riddermark Skirmish is very much the equivalent, really, of the Coldfell Maidens on the other side of the field. More Aerid of Aldberg, more Helmengas, and more Sons of Eorl as well. So nothing too surprising with regards to the choices made. We do have the Westmark Marshals, though, which it was interesting to see a lack of shock infantry, perhaps from the previous Rohan army. Not so here. Maybe the armour-piercing focus of them put DF John off, but that's not something that Ingomar fears, and I mean, they are still one of Rohan's best ways of dealing damage, armour or no. Helm's Hammer's kind of a similar sort of thing, only bodyguard to him with that massive shield that they wield, and then plenty more spears as well. Eastmarks with those javelins, and Riddermarks being the sort of standard line spears. Now then, finally, we have the Runic army, starting off with DF Filler. He has got some Carmel's Chosen. Perhaps, in terms of their overall balance, Rhun are the best all-rounders of the three factions on the field today, albeit they are still less armoured than the other Western kingdoms that they could have been facing off against, and they have got that armour-piercing edge, which actually isn't going to be that useful today against their foes. But the Carmel's Chosen, under normal circumstances, maybe find themselves outgunned as this class of unit, but that is not going to be the case here. They are going to be the best in class. Gamprim, which we have mentioned already how they don't have access to pikes, but Rohan don't have access to a phalanx unit at all, so the Gamprim can still bully them if they get situated, and considering that Rhudaur haven't brought too much in the way of pikes, we'll have to wait and see. Cumhal's Dragon Knights are the best unit of cavalry defensively on the field today, but like I said, you know, Lance Knights like this, they're going to be devastating if they get the right charge off, but if they can't find the right opening, then they could be rather disappointing. Flagrim are still a good choice, even though they do have that armour-piercing focus, and that isn't going to be the be-all and end-all in this particular battle. But they do still represent a pretty solid unit, of all-round unit, and yeah, nice armour values, good shield, and in comparison to the units they're facing off against today, with the possible exception of the Westmark Infantry, their defensive values should see them through. Eastron Clansmen, a basic unit with the first level of armour upgrade, but as far as a militia unit goes, they're pretty good at dealing with infantry. As soon as you stray into the militia sword lines, it's a bit of a barren wasteland, but the Eastron Clansmen, the best of the bunch. Fully upgraded version there as well. Variag Mercenaries I like the choice of, because it means that they can skirmish, and on this particular map you could end up in a bit of a ground war. So yeah, the Variag Mercenaries I think are the right choice. More cavalry back here as well, so yet more of this single HP cavalry that we're seeing a bit more of lately. Eastron Horse Guard. And then we've got the Scion Rim back here as well, probably the best unit of runic infantry defensively that can be massed. The Chariots are an interesting choice as well, the Wain Riders. If they're deployed at the right time, they could batter through a defence, but considering the nature of this map, patience I think is going to be key with the Chariots. And finally, Y2K86, playing as the other runic force, more Gamprim and Scion Rim, also more artillery. Like I said, the long sight lines on this map favour these artillery pieces with linear arcs of fire, and the Dragon's Breath may not be the devastating force that it once was, but this is one of the more ideal maps for it to be used. More cavalry. Variag Mercenary Riders is an interesting one, so horse archers. Over the long haul of this battle they could be very, very useful indeed. Dragon Knights, unsurprising whenever you're going to bring cavalry as Rune, that the Dragon Knights are the centrepiece. Gamprim and Clansmen once more. Eastron Hunters, the lowest tier of runic archers. Not going to be able to withstand too much in the way of punishment, but there are a lot of them. Unsurprising to see perhaps as well the other unit of multiple HP cavalry for Rune, Dragon's Wrath Warlords. I'm surprised to see so much cavalry brought on a map like this, to be honest with you, with the narrower paths that it involves. Balkoth Tribesmen, some Javelin presence, more Hunters, more Clansmen, and more Scion Rim. Few units could reveal themselves from hiding as well for Rune and for Rohan. We'll have to wait and see. I don't know how quickly the battle's going to get underway. But if it is going to get underway quickly, it will be over here between Rhudaur and Rohan. So let's wait and see, shall we? And let's get this show on the road. So we are going to get underway right away, it seems, with the Ballista from Rhudaur over here making the first initial shots into the Rohirrim positions, with some of the cavalry taking some of the damage here, and the Rhudaur archers are going to start opening up on the advancing Rhudaur forces as well. I have to say, I'm kind of rooting for Rohan, just because you don't see them really at all in this version of the game, because they're hampered in so many different ways. Already mentioned the fact that they're a faction based around more numerous units of cavalry, like the Arid of Aldberg, which is simply not that efficient in this version of the game, as I've said several times in other battles. But they're also missing a few units which in this version of the game are also extremely important, namely phalanx units, which in any sort of grindy infantry battle is going to be a real problem if you miss them. But they also lack rangers, so they lack two very important kinds of units, and the units that they have effectively to replace them are the kind which are maybe the least effective in the game as it stands. They are still playable, but they're definitely more of a challenge to utilise effectively. Perhaps here in this free-for-all setting they can utilise some of their strengths a little bit more easily, but DF John caught out really unnecessarily by these Dunman Spearmen moving in to melee with Rhudaur archers. Certainly neither of these two units is going to win any sort of awards in melee, but the Rhudaur archers in particular are going to be terrible as melee combatants, so that's something worth bearing in mind as the battle moves forwards. Another Rhudaur army, or another section of the Rhudaur army at least, moving in as well, but they're going to be forced back pretty rapidly by some Rhudaur skirmishers that are here. First Marshal's Bodyguard is a unit we haven't seen in a while. This is actually the model from Vanilla. They are, of course, the multiple HP Lancers that Rhudaur have, Rohan have, I should say. Helmingast are up to a little bit more than the Rhudaur archers, both at range, and they can look after themselves a little bit more so in melee, maybe not up to the same level as something like Bardian Marksman or the Balakith Marksman from other factions. Again, Rohan's lower armor value certainly playing its part there, but so far the ones who will be most pleased with how this battle has actually begun will be Rhun, because they are still manoeuvring, whereas Rhudaur and Rohan are currently in the throes of slaughtering one another already. These Mark Spearmen, some point-blank missile volleys, but they're going to be interrupted here by the Dunman Spearmen, and again, numbers-wise, these two units are going to be pretty similar in terms of how they perform in melee, but the numbers of the Dunman Spearmen should allow Rhudaur to continue moving forwards here. They're going after the Trollshaw Axe Throwers, which is definitely a worthwhile target. One of the most dangerous singular units on the field, especially for Rohan to have to try and deal with. But yeah, I'm not sure what the play is here from Rohan. They're going to need to at least send a unit of infantry forward so that they can stop any progress from Rhudaur as Rhudaur continue to move forward, but that will potentially open them up to some flanking movements from Rhun, albeit we can see there are a few dead Rohirrim cavalrymen over here, so they did at the very least try to do a little bit of damage to Rhun, make it so that they can't just sit back here, going after the artillery piece as well. They have spread themselves out a little bit more, Rhun, but in a way I can see why in free-for-alls people don't like people doing this, but it is ultimately up to the other players on the field as well to make Rhun do something. If you get tunnel vision and simply go after one position, you can find yourself maybe being victorious, but at such a high cost that you're ultimately going to go on to lose the battle. Rohan are finding themselves maybe in the most precarious position here, purely because more and more it's looking like they're going to be caught between Rhudaur and Rhun. They can escape into the north of the map, or they can, of course, escape into CIRITH UNGOL itself. That would put a massive target on their head, but perhaps it would be worthwhile. And again, Rohan maybe not the best at digging into a fortress for the reasons that we've already mentioned. Rhudaur Spearmen taking a few hits from the axes here. It's about time they got committed in. I was wondering why they weren't being sent into the fray. And they will be able to handily defeat a unit like Dunman Spearmen. Much more of a genuine infantry unit as opposed to a militia one. And still trading back and forth with some more minor skirmishers here. And there are still dead units over here as well, which presumably are a direct result of artillery, and indeed you can see the ballista over there. The thing is, Rohan already in this battle don't seem to really be learning their lesson. Like, this is not particularly good ground to be trying to stand on. It's relatively quiet over here now. You can see some of the runic units maybe going to take the long way around to just start maybe pressuring the rear of the Rhudaur army. But it's not as if Rhudaur are weak back here. They've got plenty of units in reserve all the way back here, trying to make it so that not all of their units are on the front line and in range of anything to shoot them. But we've got some archers that they could send forward. I mean, the Dragon's Breath is one thing, as well, as we've already seen from Rhudaur's Ballista. The Dragon's Breath could be really, really effective in this part of the battlefield, where there are only narrow corridors for enemy infantry to stand in. Shooting across these deep chasms as well is something that the artillery will be very, very useful for. Still, this is the only ongoing battle on the field so far. The Rhudaur Spearmen doing a good job here, and there's also the Dunman Pikemen that have been added in. Those shield mains of Rohan are moving forward, but they're getting absolutely savaged by the Trollshaw axe throwers. So axe thrower to axe thrower, they will do relatively similar levels of damage to one another, but the shield maidens are going after the Dunman infantry, which means the Trollshaws have been able to enact such a heavy toll on the shield maidens already. I did mention as well how important the shield maidens could be for Rohan's chances of winning this battle. I do think Jon's judgment in this battle so far, you could definitely call it into question. It's not as if Rhudaur have been able to advance into the position they're in for free, but you'd have to say that of the losses that both sides have taken in this fight so far, Rohan's have been the more significant ones. Maybe a little bit early on the commitment of the pikes, but considering the gains that they have made in response, I don't think Rhudaur and Vedaxa will be too concerned about that. The Ballista also now in position as well. He's ready to move in with a lot of his army as well. Got some units in reserve here in the back to make sure that any flanking cavalry units can't hit them from behind, so he's definitely future-proofing. And he only needs to focus really on this one front line as well. There isn't really anything else that is required. Meanwhile, we have got cavalry from Rhun, and a straight up cavalry war here between Rhudaur and Rhun. Rhun have got certainly the tankier units of cavalry, and the Rhudaur nobles are already in a little bit of danger. Rhudaur's javelin cavalry is where they could maybe equalise this fight a little bit more, however. And this is good. Whoever wins this is going to have certainly a depleted cavalry force by the end, but will still have the ability to flank around their chosen foe. Dragon's Wrath Warlords and Dragon Knights together. I mean, this is why multiple HP cavalry is so strong in this version of the game. The amount of punishment they're able to take is simply so much greater than the other cavalry units that there's really no reason not to bring them if you can. Getting close enough to the Rhudaur infantry though that the Etenmoor's Troll Hunters can start getting involved, and as soon as they start getting saturated by javelins, that's where even the mighty runic cataphracts are going to start to come undone. Another unit of Carmel's Dragon Knights, but in danger maybe of being overwhelmed. The Rhudaur nobles may not win outright against the Dragon Knights, but they will hold their own with that armour-piercing damage, and the assistance of the Coldfell Maidens will be enough to surely give Rhudaur the edge in that fight. Eastron Horse Guard are over here trying to go after some of the units in the backfield. The Black Wolds trying to hide them at the back, leave them until the late game, a classic ploy for any free-for-all that, and sallying forth with several units of Black Wolds in the late game. Pretty scary, but Rhun wise to it, uncovering them. I mean, these Eastron Horse Guard are surely going to perish at the hands of the Black Wolds, but a few charges, and as long as Rhun remember that these Black Wolds are here, certainly not the end of the world. I don't think Rhun should be continuing to try and push forward with their cavalry now. Variag Mercenary Riders also going the same way. So they're going to have to pull back, and the difference maker here is simply the fact that Rhudaur have got their infantry in close support, whereas Rhun do not. But I do appreciate the fact that they were at least trying to launch some sort of probing assault with all of this cavalry. There's also the chariots, but I would definitely be saving the chariots for another kind of engagement. These Rhudaur nobles could end up being pincered here if Rhun are paying attention, but Rhudaur are certainly paying attention. On the front, the infantry still not in any great rush to move forward, although they may be starting now to at least ask some more questions of the Rhudaur infantry over here as well by starting to launch a few archer volleys into them. There's also that other ballista as well from the Wound Raider, so trading more blows now are the men of the north and the men of the east, which can only be a good thing for the green-clad Rohirrim as this fight continues. A simple battle of attrition, perhaps. Riddermark skirmishers trying to get involved, but I would really question the validity of doing that, considering there are spears still on the front line for Rhudaur. Rhudaur clansmen moving forwards. And again, they will be able to defeat Eastmark Spearman. Balance is going to be important here, but neither side has really committed forward any sort of infantry that's really damage dealing at this point in time. Rohan haven't committed any of their, for example, Westmark infantry. They're going to be pretty efficient against most of what Rhudaur have in melee. Rhudaur haven't committed forward any of their hard-hitting infantry either. Coldfell Maidens perhaps moving forward, the ballista still going to be launching a few projectiles in here. This narrow position for Rohan, perhaps working against them as much as it's working for them, with all of the damage that Rhudaur is capable of doing. Archers are still moving forward. The ballista for the Wound Raider has moved backwards, perhaps as a result of the archers now getting in range to actually do some counter skirmishing against it. Scion Rim moving forward, so slowly but surely they're crawling towards one another. But this is the part of the map where none of the armies are going to be terribly interested in moving in, because regardless of which road you go down, you're leaving yourself open to an attack from the other angle. And if I were Rhun, I definitely wouldn't trust that Rohan wouldn't come in for a charge or two, given the fact that Rhun still, even in spite of the fact they have used their cavalry in a big way, are still the ones that have committed the least in this battle so far. So I suppose you would say that Rhun are still technically in the lead, but much can change in a battle like this. Javelins still being utilised. Riddermark skirmishers now. So Madaxa can't afford to be too stingy on the front line. Rhudaur's reinforcements are close by, but maybe not in the same quantities that Rohan can commit infantry to this ongoing fight. Ballista's still not firing for the time being. Coldfell Maidens could move in, perform the same role that the Riddermark skirmishers are for Rohan in that fight. What have we here? Rhudaur nobles moving around, so they actually have moved into this position over here, but they're not really going to be able to achieve much. This unit of Dragon Knights can chase away the Javelin cavalry should it get too close, and it's not as if they can charge directly into the Scion Rim without instantly living to regret that. They still have plenty of cavalry as well, do Rhun. And for all the cavalry that every army on the field seems to have brought, I would still question why everyone decided to go so cavalry heavy, to be honest, on a map like this. Indeed, that cavalry engagement we saw between Rhudaur and Rhun was more akin to an infantry engagement, really. Variag mercenaries starting to shoot in, and they are targeting the ballista as it gets a little bit closer. Wound Raider is trying to shield the ballista crew a little bit with some Dunman spearmen. But need to make up your mind about what you're going to be doing with this ballista now, because otherwise you could run into the same problem that many a player using artillery in Mad 2 runs into, where the artillery crew suddenly has a significant drop in IQ and decides to simply spin on the spot with their artillery, not knowing how to get out of the situation they put themselves in. It's a good opportunity to use the ballista on the runic infantry, to be fair, but they're rapidly going to be running out of time because this ballista crew coming under sustained fire from the Variag mercenaries. And, you know, they are still killing Dunman Spearmen as well with a few missed shots, so getting some sort of value for money, regardless of what they do. This fight here seems to be coming to a bit of a pause, more so than an end, but Medex's assault maybe now ending. Says the Westmark infantry was shaken for a little bit there, I'm not sure why, but Westmark's on the front line now, and perhaps that's why Rhudaur are not committing forward more infantry units, because in order to really make a fist of it against Rohan's Westmark units, they would need to commit something a little bit more substantial, and Rhudaur maybe are not ready for that kind of commitment in this battle just yet. Slowly but surely, many of the engagements that we've seen have been partial ones. No army on the field yet has been willing to go all in and really roll the dice. But that's fairly typical of a free-for-all. Helmingars are now moving forward, so they're going to start getting involved as well, and they are going after Rhun. I don't think that's the worst idea from Ingomar, because Rohan have clearly been facing off against Rhudaur on the other side, and both sides have lost a decent number of their units. So a little bit of battlefield awareness being shown there maybe, and seeing that Rhun have proportionally lost the least, so giving Rhudaur maybe a little bit of a helping hand with a unit of Helmingars. Not the worst thing to do, but the Helmingars are now moving backwards, so simply trying to save them for later. I think we are kind of in the position in this battle now where no one really wants to make the next significant move, which is perhaps why this battle is as long as it is. I think that the onus probably should be on Rhun to do so, given the fact that neither of the two runic armies have really committed to an all-out engagement just yet. The cavalry back here kind of, but it's not really the same thing as the amount of infantry that Rhudaur and Rohan have lost by going after one another. We do have First Marshal's bodyguard up here. I don't know how Rohan were able to get a unit of cavalry over here, but they are in behind enemy lines really. Could start going after individual targets. Rhun are moving as well, including with their artillery, perhaps going to go through and around CIRITH UNGOL itself, open up a new front line against Rohan. This is part of the reason why Rohan, I think, is still in the most precarious position on the field, simply because they can find themselves surrounded on every angle except this one. Ballista is getting very, very close. I mean, they can shoot at point blank, I suppose, but I don't know necessarily what that's actually going to achieve. I didn't even know that the there are some Westmark infantry in here, but I think the Rhudaur clansmen are numerous enough to the point where they will be able to defeat the Rohirrim units that are still here. Some support from the Rhudamark archers may be enough to change that, but it's just parking itself right there. Is this meant to be to try and tempt some Rohan infantry or cavalry maybe to come out from the choke point? And then they could be nailed by all of the javelins that are waiting behind the corner. Eastmark spearmen throwing a few javelins in. I don't really know. If the ballista's being parked here, I can only assume Medex has used up all the ammunition in it. And in which case just absorbing a little bit more of the Rohirrim ammunition is a fine use of their time, I suppose. Ettenmore's troll hunters throwing a javelin in. Very weird. Those Rhudamark archers could be used to help those Westmark infantry without really any sort of consequence, but no matter. Eirrevolberg here, swords draw. It must have been in melee at some time recently. getting hit by a few arrows, but again, nothing too significant, which seems to be the theme behind most of the engagements so far, but over time, these little engagements will add up to actually being noteworthy, but for the time being, no side has really lost anything overly significant. Javelins being utilised now on the Scion Rim. Definitely the kind of unit that's capable of taking an awful lot of punishment. I think Rhudaur, so you have Rhudaur and Rohan with the armor piercing they have at range and in melee, are the kind of factions that will be pretty good at dealing with the Scion Rim anyway, but they still represent the best defensive infantry that Rhun have to offer, really. But that isn't going to save them against continued javelin fire like that. What are these Variag mercenaries firing at? And they are going after the Atomor's Troll Hunters, I suppose, but this is where the armour and shields, which much of the Rhudaur army lack, do come into play for the Troll Hunters. Now then, Sons of Aor moving over here. Again, Rhun have moved, but it's not really with any great intent, if we're being honest. There's not enough of the units over here, for example, to actually really make a good fist of an assault over here. With Sons of Yul patrolling around, and also some Rohan units occupying the fortress now. What have we got here? Routing Shield Maidens. How do they get up here? This is a part of the map on CIRITH and UNGOL that I didn't even realise was accessible. Wild. It's the sort of thing which maybe someone could utilise in a future run of this map. Variag mercenaries continuing to fire in. This is not the sort of thing that Rhudaur are going to want to endure too much of. Basic archers though they may be. And again, there's the big shields that the clansmen and indeed the Troll Hunters do have at their disposal as well. But again, it's very much a slow battle, this. Which is kind of to be expected when you see a free-for-all that's 40,000 frames long, but it is what it is. Still, this fight is struggling on. It's not as significant as it used to be, perhaps, but it's still at least some genuine blood being shed on the field. A few Blackwalds in here as well. Again, it's another example of an engagement that Rohan stand no chance in. So I don't really know what the long-term goals of Rohan are being. They keep committing units forward, and it's enough to keep the fight going, but the fight has always been in Rhudaur's favour, really. There was one moment where it looked like Rhudaur was starting to lose a bit of ground, but they've regained the initiative, and it's not really been a particularly fantastic showing from Rohan over here. The only saving grace is it hasn't really been crippling to their efforts either, because as with most engagements in the battle so far, none of them have been the kind that are going to have a huge outcome individually on the outcome of the battle. Huge influence on the outcome of the battle, I should say. Fanabai Nobles coming in though, and Medexa seems to have far better battlefield awareness than the Rohirrim units that are over here. Seeing the fact that Rohan have decided to pull back their Westmark Spearmen, and it's now just Eastmark Axemen on the front line, is going to make for an easy target for cavalry to charge into. Again, not a significant amount of damage, but all of these little things are going to add up in the long run, you would suspect. Now then, with Rhun sending many of their units around to maybe take the fortress road, Rhudaur may have the opportunity to attack the runic units that are still over here in the centre of the map. I think they need to do something over here, Rhudaur, because they are just sort of stood here taking damage. Ballista firing into the infantry units that are in reserve back here, hitting Eastron Clansmen and Gamp Brim just missing the flag rim, but plenty of different units that can be hit. Now then, Rohan getting involved in a cavalry scuffle, but again, you would imagine Rohan in a cavalry fight would be fantastic. Unfortunately, however, they lack the defensive values, and they lack more than one multiple HP cavalry unit over here, so it's actually Rhun that will hold the advantage here, especially with some supporting javelin units, and indeed the throwing knives of the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen are also close by, which will definitely have their part to play. Two Sons of Yore, I suppose. And then there are a few units here which are guarding the fortress approach. Dragon's Wrath Warlords, that wasn't really a charge, too close. One thing that also dramatically affects the way that a cavalry unit charges is if the cavalry unit is set and in a good position to begin their charge. If they're still very scattered from their previous action, then any charge they enact will be significantly less effective. You're going to need a little bit more room in order to effectively land charges here. And in cramped engagements like this, the heavier cataphracts should be the ones to gain the advantage. The Dragon Knights are here. There's enough Sons of Yore, I think, now with two units of them here that Rohan will actually have the edge in terms of a cavalry, pure cavalry engagement anyway, but the difference maker here could be all these guildsmen continuing to do that damage. As the war horns start to blare across the valleys. Still nothing going on in the middle. Now everyone is kind of at least got something happening on the field, but Rohan are the ones that are being attacked from both sides at this point. Again, not to the point where they're dramatically losing ground, and I'm still really struggling to see what Rohan's thinking is over here. They've committed another unit of infantry to the front line now to prevent Rhudaur from advancing through, but it's another unit which is going to be completely vulnerable to cycle charging from those Rhanoline nobles. These are effectively free kills that Rhudaur can pick up. You have to have spears, surely. One unit of Westmark spears would be enough. It's going to be all too easy for Rhudaur to fill their boots with more kills here. Yeah, even some shield maidens. The Medicel Guard. I don't understand what you're saving all of these spears for. Very weird situation. Some shield maidens making their way over here. And Rhun, I mean, technically speaking, this engagement, I mean, it hasn't really been all that significant. Sons of Yore retreating back round to the other side. Rhun are now not too eager to move forward now that Rohan have set up a position within the fortress. And so once again, we settle back into the slower nature of this fight, I suppose. Are we seeing anything in the middle? Well, maybe. A little bit more intent. Rhudaur actually occupying the middle section of the central crossroads, which puts them at a little bit more risk, but it is also a situation in which Rhun may actually be willing to take the fight to them. I mean, these Eastron hunters are going to get slaughtered by any unit of genuine infantry, which the Rhudaur clansmen can count themselves among. As they do move forward, more intent shown here by Rhun, most certainly. Riddermark skirmishers moving forward maybe to try and grab a slice of the action for Rohan. Of course, my phone has started to go crazy when I start recording. Bloody typical. Anyway. So Rhun finally going to try and maybe leverage the fact that they've lost less infantry than their opponents. But, I mean, sending forward out of ammunition archers in the first wave is all well and good. They will end up losing. It's going to be the Loke units that need to do the heavy lifting here. What will Rohan do? They can definitely impact this engagement. And so even the out-of-ammunition archers won't do too badly. Stuff like the Variag merchants, Variag mercenaries. Considering the fact that it's only Dunman spearmen they're facing off against, there though some throwing axes coming in. The troll short axe throwers will be pretty damn effective. And it's going to be against units like the Gamp Rim where the troll short axe throwers will really find their niche. More strong plans from moving forward. So it is Filler who has really been the catalyst for the battle really getting underway over here as well. A lot of his units on the front line. Rhudaur so far though doing a decent job, and with Rohan also pushing in to do some damage against Rhun as well. Any numerical advantage that they will have picked up earlier on could be being wiped out here, but at the very least it is forcing the battle to move forward and make some progress. Area of Alberg, they're not really going to be able to get into a position to charge into anything unless they decide to go after Rhudaur. Like, anyone who's charging in with cavalry like that into the backs of your own units, it's not going to do anything. You're not going to get friendly fire from it, luckily, but you're not going to connect with anything significant. So it's a bit of a pointless gesture. The Ballista crew's still over here. And still, the continued bullying of the Rhanodine nobles has continued. Maybe not doing damage as quickly as they could, but it's still virtually free kills. And what are Rhun doing? Have they retreated? I mean, kind of, yes. They're further away from the actual fortress now, even though there's less Rohirrim units in there, so really, it is the central crossroads once again, where the main fight is going to be taking place. Helmingas and more Westmark spearmen moving in. More out of necessity than anything else now that Rhun have decided to commit forward some Flag Rim, which are going to be significantly more dangerous for any Rohirric infantry. There's Gamp Rim of routed as well, which is unfortunate because it did look as though Rhun were actually making some progress against the Rhudaur infantry over here, but that progress looks to have been stymied. Over here, Etamil's Troll Hunters and Rhudaur Clansmen. Plenty of these units for Rhudaur on the front line as spearmen, so they're going to struggle a little bit more to do consistent damage to Rhun. We now see the runic artillery as well, managing to directly hit the Helm's hammers. Poor DF John, he's been really on the receiving end of a lot that's fairly unfortunate in this battle, though I will say that in terms of the grander scheme of things and unit movement, he's brought a fair amount of it on himself. At the very least he is moving the Helm's hammers away from this position now. Kamal's Chosen moving forward. Bodyguards here, unit of infantry, which will be more than sufficient to deal with anything that Rohan have on the front line at this point in time, although as much as Rhun are making real inroads against both Rohan and Rhudaur, they're taking an awful lot of damage for their trouble, with the Rohirrim archers on one side and the Rhudaur projectiles coming in from the other. They're taking a lot of damage for the progress that we're actually seeing. Sons of Yorl on the way. Having cavalry in the late game here could prove to be very, very useful indeed. Westmark Marshals moving forward now. Prevent any sort of advance from Rhudaur over here. Rhudaur Clansmen will be butchered, of course, by Westmark Marshals. And actually, while the cavalry can charge into shock infantry like this and be effective, this is at least the kind of unit where if the cavalry sticks around for too long with Rhanodine nobles, then the Westmark Marshals will do substantial damage to them. It's one thing the heavy axemen can be very good at. Still a fair amount of cavalry back here for the Rohirrim. The Rohirrim have been forced away from the very centre though, for the most part. Thinking about committing their Medicell Guard in here as well. The Westmark Spearmen pretty much the only thing they have left over here after all. Medicell Guard will be able to go toe to toe with the Carmel's Chosen, more so than anything else Rohan have had over here. Helm's Hammers would be the ideal antidote to the Rhun problem over here, but we'll see. Scion Rim back over there still guarding the artillery. Has this been worthwhile for the Easterlings? I'm not sure it has, simply because Rhudaur still have reinforcements that they can commit forwards. I think maybe the upshot of all of this is that Rhun, Camel's Shadow Guard revealing themselves, Scion Rim, they do still have a few units over here, so perhaps even if their push in the middle does fail, the politics of a free-for-all may start to come into it, and Rhun, as all of a sudden maybe the weakest faction on the field, numbers-wise, can simply lurk in the shadows while Rhudaur and Rohan continue to knock 7 bells out of one another. We shall have to wait and see. Shield Maidens. They can scarcely miss the Shield Maidens. I think they are intending to go after Rhun, but if any stray throwing axes go into Rhudaur as well, I'm sure they won't lose any sleep over that. Westmark infantry could be moved in, which they probably should be once again. Like Rohan, I think more so than the other factions, have had a bit of a problem with having reinforcements ready to go, but simply not utilising them when maybe they should. Because they do have a good opportunity here between themselves and the Medicell Guard to wipe out this front line of Rhun, and that could really start to bring about the Easterling collapse here in the middle. The cavalry could also fill the same role. The Aelred of Aldburg are there. The rest of the Runic cavalry on the way over to perhaps try and prevent Rohan from doing this. Yeah, not the best of charges that, but they do actually land it. The Lancers did come down. This is where Rohan, who've maybe struggled the most out of all 3 of them on the field today. That was friendly fire from Rhun, killing their own general in an effort to try and kill the Rohirrim cavalry. That surely is going to bring about the end of this runic assault. Westmark Spearmen are routing though, as are the Scion Rim though. In fact, most of the units that are over here are routing as a result of the Dragon's Breath getting involved. Camel's Chosen, of course, made of slightly sterner stuff, but we'll see how long that lasts for as the Sons of Yor continue to charge in. Defeat seems certain now. What is going on back here? Randine nobles maybe thinking about charging in from the rear. Got to be careful of the stakes. I'm sure that they can see them. Due consideration given. Shield Maidens of Rohan throwing their projectiles in. All that's left that Rohan have over here is having to be committed to try and stop a renewed advance from Medexa. But for Odrum Javelins, Witchram Enslavers, some pikes as well, late game pikes. Now the only faction with the ability to bring such a thing to bear. Rohan still have a few things they can commit over here, but are they going to do so? I think the Carmel's units are maybe moving over here as well. Not necessarily. Gamprim. What's going on in the fortress itself? Nothing. So those Carmel's units simply returned to hiding. No clansmen routing. Rohan no longer have the number of infantry required to keep Rhudaur in check over here. As the javelins continue to rain down. What have we down this way? Westmark Spearmen chasing off some of the Camel's Chosen, so Rhune's assault has ended. Rhudaur and Rohan combined, really, forcing them back, and now Rhun have consolidated around their artillery once again. You won't find Rhun coming back over here to try and go for round 2 in this position, so if anyone is going to advance through here, it will have to be one of Rhudaur or Rohan, and considering Rohan's somewhat compromised nature on the other front line they've got going on, it will have to be the Wound Raider if there is to be another fight that starts over here, but he may well bide his time and wait for his ally to make more progress against Rohan over here before he does so. I do think that Rhudaur are probably the faction, at least from units that we can see, that are in the best position going into what will be the decisive phase of this battle. Shield Maidens are back here. It's another situation where I don't really know what Rohan are waiting for with regards to these infantry units, because either they need to leave this area entirely, or they need to stop sending single units in to face off against a more combined assault. But Rohan will ultimately end up paying for this manner of playing the game, I think, in the long run, because they've simply lost too many units in this manner for it to be sustainable in the long run, unless Rhudaur and Rhun, with what's left of their armies, decide to really try and tear one another to pieces, but that's unlikely given the way that the battlefield currently lies. Berserkers are close by. There's also the Witch Realm Enslaver, so some really high quality units that Rhudaur still have at their disposal. Westmark's cavalry still a presence on the field, which could yet prove to be of great import. What is this? Some Rhudaur cavalry here charging in and actually going after the Dragon's Breath artillery crew. Kind of fortunate, I suppose, that the Franadine Nobles are so depleted and the Coalfell Maidens don't have as impressive a charge, because otherwise Rhun could be in real danger of losing their artillery here, which is clearly a big part of what they're hoping will see them over the line in this one. I don't know how much ammunition they have left, but if they can force the right kind of engagement, this is the kind of thing which could lead to a runic victory. Balkoth, Eastrons. Rohan's still not keen on moving forward, understandably so, but more reinforcements have now been committed. Finally, better late than never, but it was after their Helm's Hammers had already been mostly killed. Westmark infantry moving forward though, and they will do pretty damn well against the basic rank and file of Rhudaur, like I said, but Westmarks will struggle significantly more against the bodyguard tier units, those Witch Realm Enslavers, with their tridents. Will do a good job. Cavalry in behind the lines, and the fact that Rhudaur are the ones utilising their cavalry effectively here, even though Rohan have got their cavalry in close proximity, is another sign that Rhudaur have simply utilised their units in a better manner than Rohan have throughout this battle really as a whole. And that's the sort of thing which is going to add up come the end of the battle, I'm sure. Riddermark Axemen moving in, they won't be able to get a charge off because their own infantry is in the way, but at the very least it will add more bite to the Rohirrim front line as they try to prevent the Northman advance. And this has been a fight which, in this one little gap, has spanned the entirety of the battle, really. And it's one that Medexa has always had a slight edge in, I think. Not an overwhelming one, but Sons of You all are here. If they stick around in melee too long though, however, the Dunman Pikemen that are part of this front line will be a real issue for them. Shield Maidens struggling, and it's the bodyguard tier units which are giving Rhudaur the leg up here. If not for them, Rohan would actually be winning this fight, I think, and it calls into question why they're not committing that unit of Helm's Hammers in, because that would be enough to help turn this battle around. Interestingly enough, Rhun actually are willing to move forward and be the ones to take the fight to the middle of the battlefield once again. A strong clansman and Scion Rim, that's going to be enough to force Rohan backwards. Camille's Shadow Guard on the way forward. Rhudaur have got a few units, including the mighty Franadine Berserkers, much of them some form of throwing projectile unit that have run their ammunition supply dry. Don't know what happened to the artillery crew, maybe out of ammunition now. No, actually just over there. I'm still not sure where I would call this battle. Still, everyone has got stuff that they have in reserve that can be committed at any moment. This I'd like to know what the thinking behind this move from Rhun was. It's not necessarily the wrong thing to do, I suppose. I mean, a lot of these Rohan units are pretty vulnerable after all. There's no doubt that the Scion Rim will be able to defeat these out of ammunition Rhudaur archers, but to move forward and be the aggressor here, I mean, Rhudaur are obviously going to let Rhun do this because it's effectively allowing Rhun to do their dirty work for them before they then move in and try to finish them off. Perhaps something which the other players on the field are worried about is the presence still of Rohan cavalry units. Possibly. Back over here. Blackwald's moving in, another multiple HP unit, another high damage unit which Rohan are having to deal with, and once again Rohan find themselves being attacked by Rhudaur in one part of the map and Rhun in the other. They have been the ones caught in the middle more often than not, so that's something they have had to contend with, and I suppose in most free-for-all situations that's the sort of thing which can end a battle pretty quickly for you, so in many ways Rohan have actually done quite well to withstand this kind of pressure throughout the battle, but it is going to start to take its toll now, I think. Those nobles need to be careful not retreating too far and then charging back through the stakes. It is a mistake that I have seen made before. Rhudaur Axemen. Still they have units in reserve, but what are they saving them for at this point in time, I wonder? Franadines. Rangers as well. Rhudaur are starting to shuffle around a little bit. Colfell Maidens are routing. Helmingas moving in to try and help shore up this front line, and Scion Rim, they will get their killing done relatively slowly, I suppose, but there's still a certain inevitability about all of this. Dragon's Wrath. Throwing knives, very good. Peeling away some of the manpower that Rohan still have left to them. When will Rhudaur make their move? I suspect the reason that they aren't is maybe feigning a little bit of weakness. Still have those Fraudulent Javelins after all, they still have Franadine Berserkers, Trollshell Axe Throwers. Too many of their units perhaps are throwing skirmishers that have run out of ammunition, which is why they're not feeling overly confident, but given their allies' progress as well, I think it's only a matter of time before Rhudaur really sees the initiative here. There goes one of the Rohirrim generals. So we haven't, sadly in a way, I think, we haven't seen the actual fortress itself be a fixture in this battle, but yeah, I mean, this I think is probably justified punishment for Rohan. They've been effectively leaving this unit in reserve until the end, but it's so exposed and they're going to be punished for that now. That cavalry flattening the unit of Helm's Hammers, and this is pretty much the death knell for Rohan's chances of winning this, because the rest of their units is over there being engaged by Rhun, and there is now no escape that the rear lines that they were occupying before have now been occupied by one of the Rhudaur armies as well. The Helm's Hammers one last act of defiance, but going up against another bodyguard unit in the Enslavers. And the runic artillery fires as well. Choosing now to enact their grand betrayal, perhaps. Rhudaur, which was, I mean, Rhun would have seen it coming. It was obvious that at some point the Wound Raider was going to attack, and now with Rohan starting to collapse, the time has to be now, while Rhun is still scattered. Camille's Shadow Guard. Morale may prove to be a little bit of an issue, as some of the runic armies are starting to quit the field in their entirety. Point blank throwing projectiles, but I mean the Shadow Guard are dangerous, but nowhere near as dangerous as Berserkers, especially not Berserkers being backed up by throwing axes. What remains of the runic force probably just going to have to be thrown in. Another unit of Shadow Guard, Shadow Bows up on the hill, but far away, though those units that are revealing themselves will give another wave to the runic attack. Rhudaur Marksmen and Blackwolds over here, Medexa's army moving in. Some of these runic units are now going to be in danger of being cut off, but I don't know, it all depends on whether those units that Rhun have been holding back until the end, so some Shadow Bows and some more Shadow Guard, are they going to be enough to make the difference? I don't know. I think, interestingly enough, still, the Rohirrim General, very much alive. One of the two Theodens, this one on foot, is actually doing a very good job here, carving his way through some of the finer warriors that Rhudaur have to offer. Another one killed. He kills another one as well, so it's going to be a duel between the generals here by the looks of things. Well, it was. Theoden actually bailed out in the end, and one of the Rhudaur generals falls as a result of that. Westmark infantry revealing themselves. Maybe Rohan, I mean, I've seen stranger things happen, I suppose, in this game than a sudden Rohan victory, but it would rely on Rhudaur and Rhun basically fighting one another to very low numbers to allow that level of Rohan, although that level of Rohan units to be allowed to win the battle. Scion Rim taking hits. Sapphire Bladesman moving forward, so Filler has left some very decent units in reserve indeed. Shadow Bows. There goes the other Rhudaur general as well, so maybe in typical free-for-all fashion, leaving a little bit extra in reserve is going to be what proves to be the difference maker in favour of Rhun here. Paradigm Berserkers and Pikes doing their thing. That, I mean, it has to be a runic general, surely. Guess it could be a Rohirrim one. But they're still waiting. Biding their time. More Blackwolds on the way forward. Rhudaur Marksmen still have a bit of ammunition. Rhudaur Clansmen running for the hills. And Paradigm Nobles having to be the ones to do the business. It's a lot of damage dealing as well. I mean, most of it is more of an armor piercing focus, but it'll be more than enough to deal with rangers in melee, the Reforged javelins being thrown in as well, and I think more and more we're starting to see that Rhun have the edge here. Balakoth Sapphire Bladesman as well. I mean, pretty damn good one-to-one anyway dealing with the Blackwolds, although this is a fresh unit which Medexa has sent in, so Rhudaur trying to fight fire with units that have been saved until the last moment. Shadow Bows still trying to get into a position where they can actually do the business, and unfortunately I think the Shadow Bows have waited a little bit too long to start launching volleys into this front line, because Medexa and Womb Raiders, Blackwolds appear to be the main difference maker here. And that is a little bit unfortunate, perhaps. Yeah. A valiant effort from Rhun, but it's not going to be enough. I think ultimately this is going to be a Rhudaur victory. Yeah, there goes some of the runic units. Technically speaking, Rhun may fall before Rohan even, with the Westmark infantry still in the distance over there, because I think that's them. Yes, it is. Not going to be enough though. The sneaky final quarter victory ultimately not going to happen. And this was a slow burn of a free-for-all, but relatively typical as far as free-for-alls ultimately go. Playing tag with one another for the vast majority of the battle, and then it's really the final quarter or fifth of the battle really is where much of the important stuff happens. You're laying the groundwork for the moment when you want to drop the hammer. And if you do so too early, you're going to get ganged up on. If you do it too late, you're not going to be able to reclaim the initiative from one of the other factions on the field. And so it has turned out to be. From the earlier points of this battle, though, I do think Rhudaur were, right from the off against Rohan, they were definitely taking slightly more efficient engagements. The Womb Raider was very patient in the middle, allowing Rhun to maybe take on much of the risk, and considering Rohan were struggling in other sections of the battlefield, perhaps this was an outcome that could have been predicted at around the halfway mark, in hindsight. But there we have it. Rhun are gone, for the most part. Sapphire Bladesman, one banner carrier is all that remains. And that is going to be that. Not a huge amount left for Rhudaur though. A couple of units of Blackwolds in various states of disrepair, very depleted pikes, very depleted berserkers, and Rhudaur marksmen. 100 or so men of Rhudaur remain. And yeah, I think worthy victors for the reasons that we've already mentioned. As far as what Rohan could have done differently, I think, like I said, the moments when they chose to reinforce their lines and in what quantities needed to change, they were taking too many engagements, which were just effectively slowly bleeding them out at the wrists, which was not great. Also, the position they were in, while it didn't really come to pass that they got collapsed in on from all angles in a big way, they were still being attacked from multiple different directions from both of their foes, and they didn't really recognise that, and they didn't really get out of the way. Rhun bided their time in the early game, but when it got to the mid game and onwards, they were actually the ones that were taking the aggressive actions more so than anyone else, maybe too much so, because they were moving forward aggressively, and effectively it was playing into Rhudaur's hands by the end of the battle. And too often we saw Rhun as well. One of the decisions which maybe really affected the outcome of the battle was Rhun went after Rohan over here towards the late game, and the Womb Raider was just sort of sat there watching them do that. Maybe Rhun, if they wanted to do that, they should have just done so with a portion of their army, and then maybe just kept a watch over the Rhudaur position, maybe move forward their shadow bows to act as a sort of deterrent against what ultimately ended up happening. But yeah, I think Rhudaur worthy victors. Let's see what did the damage for the Rhudaur armies then. Enslavers did quite well when they were committed forward. Axe throwers always a big part of what Rhudaur try to do. Further down, it's a lot of kills on the Franadine Nobles, 396, so the cavalry ultimately proving to be a good addition, but then many of those kills probably were against those units that were just sort of stood there taking those charges, remember. Ballista also doing decently, putting the pressure on the enemy. Berserkers in this army doing nicely. Franadine Nobles maybe less impressive than Medexa's unit, but still 100 kills on a map like this is decent, and it gives you a lot of map control and mobility. Franadine Rangers here, 468, is a very fine return in a free-for-all, but like I said, it is the kind of map where you do have the potential to use Rangers very effectively, given the corridor-esque nature of the middle of this map, which is where much of the killing ended up taking place. Axe throwers also, and then obviously the late game, the Black Quolls were the unit which proved too strong for Rhun in the end. So big thank you to the Womb Raider for sending this one in. Another one of the players sent this to me as well. I can't remember who it was because several of these players have sent me replays in the past. So it escapes me, but irregardless, big thank you to all the players for being a part of this one. Nice to see a free-for-all, albeit a slower burning free-for-all. First one that we've seen in a little while. I'm going to be doing a couple more sieges in the coming week or so. Moving into December, I got given a fair few from 2 times. I got given another replay as well from Winged Swordsman. I got given a lore-friendly Good versus Evil siege, which may very well actually be the very next battle that we end up seeing. And then there's a few other things, a few other bits and pieces as well, like I've already mentioned, like the live stream, which I do intend to do at some point, but I need to know exactly what's going on before I can do so, and unfortunately I still don't have full clarity on what's actually going to be going on in that regard, so we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, big thank you to all the players once again. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.